Man, that quote alone kind of blows up the book.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll get into that, yeah, that's a really good reminder, but also tough. That's tough. Yeah, we'll get to that. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Book on Fire podcast. This is episode 3. Here on the land, we are enjoying a sudden burst of springtime, actually. The crocuses are blooming. They're so beautiful. And the birds that live here all year with us are beginning to sing their songs, attracting mates, claiming territory, and just getting ready for the breeding season. So that's a new thing. It's exciting.
Yeah, we woke up to almost a dawn chorus, like a spring-like dawn chorus. The robin we heard in the woods, which is a sign of spring, and you can still hear, or we can still hear, outside the house, the frogs that mate in the pond in the early spring are just getting done. There's like one frog left.
Yeah.
It sounds like, but a huge mass of eggs.
So there will be some more winter to come, or more cold weather probably. There usually is. We sometimes have cold weather even into May, on and off. But we're moving into spring, so we are getting busier, but we're going to keep these episodes coming.
Yeah.
And keep talking about the dawn of everything.
Yeah.
This episode, as a reminder, is going to be a little bit different than the rest of them in that we're not actually talking about a chapter of the book today. As we mentioned last time, we're going to be talking about some related anthropology and field work of some of David's colleagues and the implications of that work on what the dawn of everything is arguing. Mm-hmm. This has been pretty fascinating stuff to start learning about, which I feel grateful that the dawn of everything and its critics, honestly, have led us to some of these other rad anthropologists and their work. And that's exciting. Dave did a lot of the prep for this, and so he's going to be doing more of the presentation of this material. And so I will be learning alongside you. We don't always do things that way, but we thought we would give it a shot and see how it goes to have me learn with you all while Dave presents what he's been researching and learning about. And I'm pretty excited because the little bit I already know about has been really titillating.
Yeah, I've always had an interest in anthropology. And that's probably the reason why I was a fan of David Graeber from a very early time when I first encountered his stuff. And one of the legacies that Graeber in particular has left us is opening up the field of anthropology to a wider audience. Mm-hmm. And he was very adamant that the findings and the knowledge and the theory that's kept within the realm of anthropology should not just be cooped up in the ivory tower of academia. That really, it is of great relevance to all of us, especially those who are maybe engaged in politics in any way. And he worked very hard to make anthropology more accessible and more relatable for people.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that spirit, reading The Dawn of Everything has encouraged us, the two of us, to engage with the larger field of anthropology, like specifically related to what this book is about, right? So yeah, as promised in this episode, we are going to take time to describe some scholarship and really whole forms of scholarship that the authors mostly leave out of their book. But that are a large and really important part of this conversation that the authors are trying to have about the dawn of everything, you know? That is the dawn of humanity, the dawn of hierarchy, the dawn of the state, the dawn of farming, all these things that they tackle in the book. And in just the first 2 chapters of the book that we've already read and talked about, the trends have become clear. And we'll have just a much more fruitful and informed reading of the book if we understand the broader scope of scholarship and social theory, including most of radical left-wing anthropology, that the authors are in conflict with, but that they seldom engage with directly. You know, in a typical scholarly text, you present all the prevailing theories and the interpretations of the evidence, and then you argue for your interpretation. But The Dawn of Everything is really not that kind of book. Instead of debating their like best informed, most up-to-date peers who align with their politics, they choose to refute people like Steven Pinker, like Jared Diamond, who don't know what they're talking about. Or if they do invoke scholars to refute, which when they do it, they often do it without naming them. Mm-hmm. Maybe in the footnotes you get a name. Then it's often like the most close-minded conservative scholars, or they refute ideas that were current in anthropology in like the 1950s while acting like that's still what everybody thinks. Mm-hmm. Right? So you get this kind of stuff instead. And all of that allows them to come off as like the only reasonable like grown-ups in the room. Mm-hmm. It's rhetorically very useful for them, but it doesn't give the readers a very honest and informed appraisal of the current state of anthropology, mm-hmm. right? That's the problem. And as you might imagine, it has like made their colleagues annoyed, to say the least.
Yeah.
A lot of why we want to do this episode is because the book's reception among people who actually know a lot about the topics they're discussing has been mixed. There's been a lot of criticism. Mm-hmm. And we decided, rather than going through the whole book and then talking about that at the end of the season, say, which could be one approach, that it would be more generative to have the criticism in mind as we're reading it. Mm-hmm. Especially like because it's so easy with this book to get swept up in the flow and not notice all of the flaws and weaknesses in their arguments. So we want to be able to pay attention to those things as we're going along. But that said, we're actually not going to focus so much on the critiques here in this episode. Our focus instead will be on presenting the alternate theories and conclusions that anthropologists have reached that don't get a fair hearing in the book. But still, if you're reading Dawn of Everything now, and you'd rather just focus on what Wengrow and Graeber are saying, then maybe you want to skip this episode? But also I can't promise that we're not going to be referring to this stuff in later episodes. Mm-hmm. Because, I don't know, to me that's just what a reading group is about. You bring different perspectives and reactions on the text and you kind of talk them through, mm-hmm. right? So we're going to try and have a broader view mm-hmm. of what is being talked about in the book. And of course, this is not going to be exhaustive. It's just going to be an outline of some stuff so that we have a better idea of what's out there and we can refer to it later. And, I should also say that I'm not sure what I think about all of this yet, mm-hmm. as far as, prevailing theories and which is the better and, what's the truth at the end of the day and everything. Part of the reason for this podcast and for inviting the discussion that we do is, because we're trying to talk it over and figure it out. Okay, so now to get to this other anthropology that we want to present, what I've come to call the third perspective in, an admittedly simplifying way. I call it the third because I keep picturing a triangle and at one point on the triangle is Graeber and Wengrow. They're at one position. And then at another point on the triangle are all of these bad thinkers and bad ideas that they set themselves up against. People like Steven Pinker, Jared Diamond, or even Rousseau for that matter. People who defend capitalism, people whose ideas are uninformed or out of date, and who Graeber and Wengrow can easily mobilize our sympathies against. Mm-hmm. Graeber and Wengrow want to keep us focused on the argument between these two sides, these two positions. But there's not just two positions. It's actually, in my schema, a triangle. And there's an unacknowledged third point, right? And over on this third position is a cluster of contemporary scholars, which actually includes most of left-wing anthropology at this point. And these people also disagree with Pinker and Diamond mm-hmm. and the defenders of capitalism. But they disagree with Graeber and Wengrow too, mm-hmm. and have a different way of making sense of the story of humanity than they do. And it's worth knowing what these scholars think and how they think. And to be fair, there are a couple of instances where Dawn of Everything refers to these colleagues of theirs, but it's always kind of obliquely, usually dismissively, and without doing them justice. And so let's get into it. All right. Well, before I get started, I want to say thanks to Daniel, who has a podcast called What is Politics? Daniel is a anthropology grad, and he's done a good job of summarizing a lot of like the state of anthropology and various contemporary trends in anthropology. And especially I have him to thank for pointing me in the direction of some of these contemporary anthropologists who I'm going to be leaning on heavily in what I'm about to present, and whose articles and things I've, spent the last month or couple months reading. So yeah, you might want to check that out. What is Politics? I'll put the link in the show notes. Okay, so we're going to take this like one step at a time. So sit back, and we're going to start with some big picture stuff, and then it'll narrow down, I think, as it goes on to more specific theories that have more specific place and time. But first, I want to start off by talking about a lens, or maybe is it one lens or two? I'm not sure. A lens that is important in social theory in general, not just anthropology. It's nice to have this framework and have an understanding of this when you're just approaching explanations for things that happen in the world that are out there, whether it's something you hear on the news, something you hear your friends say, something you read in a book like The Dawn of Everything. And that is the difference between what are called idealist versus materialist explanations. So idealist versus materialist, we can also talk about idealism versus materialism. And right away, I have to say that like these words don't totally have the meaning that they do in everyday speech.
Yes.
In this framework, like we usually think of idealism. Idealism is a focus on things maybe being the best that they could be in some way, and we call somebody an idealist maybe because they're not hampered by the like harsh realities as far as their estimation of what's possible, maybe. And that's not quite what's meant here. And also materialism, we use that to talk about, maybe people who are obsessed with stuff and material accumulation of objects. That's not what's being talked about here either. The key root of the word idealist or idealism is idea. So idealist explanations are ones that explain phenomena, social phenomena in the world as being driven by ideas. Driven by ideas. And we're going to give some examples about the difference between idealist and materialist explanations. So this will become more clear. But then the materialist explanations explain things more by what are called material conditions. And what are material conditions? Just in the most obvious way, it's like being confined into like a really small box is a material condition, right? Like if you're in a box that's too small for you to stand in, then you're materially being prevented from standing up, and it doesn't matter that your body's made to stand up, that you feel like you have a right to stand up, you just cannot stand up because there's a material condition that's preventing you from standing up, and
the flooding of the Nile, creating a very fertile place, encouraged people to settle there and time their lives around that flooding.
Right. So now you're getting right into anthropology. Exactly. It's like, why did people settle in the Nile Valley? Well, there was a material condition of fertile soil and the continual renewal of the fertility of the soil through the annual flooding of the Nile that created a fertile condition for a civilization to arise, let's say, so this would be an example of a material condition.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I think of these two framings as being something that comes up a lot in Marxist theory.
Yeah.
Is this did Marx actually come up with this, or did this delineation come before him?
I don't know if like the theoretical naming of these two poles of analysis originated with Marx at all. I'm not sure. It's possible. It's possible that the theorization of this started with Marx or with his contemporaries or something. But obviously material and ideal or idealist explanations for things are as old as, because this is just two different ways to think, sort
right.
of, and they're not mutually exclusive, and it's not either or. Right. I just got to say that from the very beginning, right? Because it's not a binary. It's just like two different flavors of things, and they kind of mix. And, for instance, nowadays we typically think of economic factors as material conditions, right? Even though money, contracts, agreements, the whole economy is a web of sort of fictions that exist in people's minds.
Right.
Right? And so you'd think that that's kind of idealist or whatever, but we think of it as material. And if you stop paying your rent,
right,
then you will materially be kicked out of your house.
Right.
Even
if you explain to your landlord that money isn't real and it's imaginary,
Yeah, right. Right. So economic conditions in the modern world, the economy, wages, money, rent and private property and all these things, even though they're built on fictions, are an element of material conditions. So you have, get used to thinking about that. And so just to give a couple examples that might make this more clear, if we say that the transatlantic slave trade was motivated by the racism of Europeans against others, or the devaluation of non-Christians in a hierarchy that enabled this form of exploitation, then these are idealist explanations, right? It's saying that this was driven by the ideas that the Europeans had in their head. Ideas about racial supremacy, ideas about religion and Christianity, and who you were allowed to exploit, right? And these were definitely factors, right? But when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade being driven by the need for hyper-exploitable workers in the colonies, let's say, to drive the burgeoning capitalist economic machine, now we're talking about material conditions. Right? So these are two different ways of providing explanations for the same type of phenomena. And moving to the present, and talking about, let's say, the climate crisis, when you hear people say, we'll never have a solution to the climate crisis until people start realizing that they're a part of the earth and that the environment, quote unquote, is not something that's out there for us to manage. And we need a consciousness shift to realize this more interconnected way of inhabiting the earth, then that's proposing an idealist solution. Right? It's like we need to change the way we're thinking about things in order to get to where we need to go. But if we then turn around and point out that the fight to mitigate climate change is going to be hampered by the powerful corporations and the oil lobby and the economic engine that relies on mining fossil fuels, then now we're pointing out a material obstacle.
Yeah, and in that example, which I think is a really good one, because we see a lot of idealist framing of climate crisis and response. And on the individual level, like the emphasis is so much on each of us needs to change consciousness, right?
Yeah.
But on the individual level, increasingly what is like impossible to ignore at this point is that on the individual level, most of us are not only seeing crisis and overwhelmed by crisis around us, but experiencing crisis through health challenges, through the amount of work most people are required to do to even survive with the just collapse of the economy. There's so many different material factors that make just the idea that a change in consciousness will be enough almost laughable. Because who is, like, when we're exhausted in survival mode all the time and concerned for the actual physical safety of our loved ones and our communities, then how are we just going to shift how we think about our place and have that be enough, you know?
Yeah.
And so you can see here, like, this is where, like, the critique of idealism becomes clear. You can see the limitations of it, but there's also limitations of a strictly materialist point of view as well.
Right.
But when people are upset about Wingrove and Graeber kind of ignoring material conditions, or that's one of the accusations maybe you're not going to get to that, but
no, we will.
Okay.
Yeah.
when people are upset about them ignoring material,
a little further on down on
material
the outline.
conditions, it has to do with that. Like I can say it's going to take more than us just shifting our consciousness around this, right?
Yeah, right.
And so what is true in the world that we live in right now is that there are a lot of forces of domination, whether those are the state working for corporations, the armed force of the police that is enforcing the state and the corporations.
Right.
All of these different factors are material conditions that we live under that keep us from acting on these changes in consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
from actualizing them.
Right.
In a substantial way.
Right.
In a way that actually impacts daily life, And I don't think anybody thinks that a purely materialist lens is what we need, or a purely idealist lens is what we need. But we can use these two poles of idealism and materialism, the way we're defining it here, to sort of as a lens to be able to it's a helpful way to be able to say, okay, is this veering into, extreme idealism? Is this a material reductionist framework that does not take into account people's attitudes and desires and thoughts and theories and needs? It's definitely true. At least I think that ideas have consequences too, And so it's how do we mix these forms of analysis in a way that's actually effective and accounts for things well? One more example of ideal versus material analysis that I just wanted to throw in too, because it's relevant to the book on fire. In the last season, we read Caliban and the Witch. And if you've read Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici, then you might remember that her book offers a materialist explanation for the witch trials.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? Because it's not just the witch trials because misogyny.
Right.
Or something like that. It's the witch trials because the ruling classes needed to rework the role of women in society in a way that was compatible with capitalism by making them unpaid domestic workers, so that the men could go work in the factories and come home to dinner at the end of, their 12-hour shift or something. But this is kind of the idea, right? She's like, this had to happen because this material reorganization of the world was happening around capitalist mode of production. And this is how that impacted women in Europe at this time period, right? So Silvia Federici is a Marxist feminist. And as Janet alluded to earlier, Marx and the Marxist tradition is noted for being a materialist tradition, right? And he in fact called his whole theory historical materialism, right? And there's actually a quote from Marx that gets repeated a lot, and I don't have it in front of me, but it basically says, people create their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing.
Right.
So in that quote, we get agency, right? We actually do create our own history. But the conditions in which we create our history are not conditions that we have chosen. And so we have to act within the material conditions and utilize our agency within that.
Man, that quote alone kind of blows up the book.
Yeah.
We'll get into that, yeah, that's a really good reminder, but also tough. That's tough. Yeah, we'll get to that. But I think we might need to bring that quote back in later once we get really going on the argument and what's possible.
Yeah. I'm bringing this up because most of anthropology does consider material conditions and considers material conditions to be an important input, an important influence on culture and on how people live. And as Janet has kind of alluded to already, The Dawn of Everything is not a very materialist text. In fact, some of the critics call it just almost like a manifesto of idealist anthropology and politics. We've already talked about how they really emphasize choice that different political formations that humans have had through time and place have existed as experiments in social organization that were chosen. So this is basically, that is idealism there. To be like, they are that way because they chose it, right? That is an idealist explanation. Versus they are that way because of some complex hybrid of like choice and material conditions. The book is not entirely without consideration of material conditions, but when it does happen, you stand up and are like, oh, look what they're doing here for one paragraph.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I would also say that, while it's not always something that people are considering when they have this critique of the idealism, but in the case of this book, as an idealist text, in some ways, what is also true is that we get a sense of all of these different peoples as somewhat disconnected from their environs. Yeah. And so when part of what material conditions are like what plant communities do you live in, what bodies of water are nearby, how fertile is the place, what are the relationships on the more than human world, all of that. Like that's part of what culture arises from and in relation to. Yeah. And so to have such an idealist push or framing kind of separates people from humans, from their worlds in a way. Yeah. And so while we might not be talking about that so specifically here right now, I just want to point out that too, like that people might not always think of materialism as meaning embedded and in relationship with the world around you. But it is that,
oh, absolutely. That. Yeah, that's a really good point. To consider material conditions is to acknowledge the fact that ways of life are embedded in a place. And the complex relations with all of the elements of that place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that culture is like emerges from connection.
Right.
And very much is tied to ecological relationships.
Yeah, for sure. Especially when we're talking about prehistoric people.
Yes.
Because, I mean, it's no less true now, but now there is like a vast superstructure of built material conditions. Like we were talking about, like rent and the economy and money and
air conditioning.
There's all this stuff that humans have sort of erected on top of the earth. I mean, we shouldn't talk about it like that. It's all part of the earth and what's happening on it. But in some places, you can have the illusion that you are not connected to what is outside the human constructs. Yeah. It's an illusion. Layers of alienation.
Right, absolutely.
From actually the earth and the ecosystems we inhabit, But when we're talking about these older prehistoric people, which is a lot of what this book is about, then it's like it's very clear that these are their material conditions.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't really separate them from that.
Yeah. As we'll talk about later and in some of the other chapters too, like if the dawn of everything ever does kind of make an argument against a more materialist analysis, then they do it by like invoking that specter of determinism. The extremity of materialism would be a strict determinism, like people don't have no choice. They are just forced into being how they are by material conditions, and it's strictly deterministic. And they use the specter of determinism in order to avoid looking at material conditions usually, and, so this is I would say this is sort of an unfair argument. It's kind of a version of straw manning where like all of materialism is just now determinism.
Right.
When really that's not how that goes, So with that framing, idealism versus materialism, and the fact that anthropology uses material analyses in order to explain things in part, and that the book repeatedly and pretty consistently leaves material analyses out, especially in these early chapters when they're trying to make these big pronouncements about early humanity and all of this. Now, maybe we can see a little bit of this third pole kind of emerging, where some of the unacknowledged anthropology is this materialist anthropology, or more, materially accountable anthropology.
Like their theories are like their theories, because they do still have some speculation and theories, especially about prehistory.
Oh, yeah.
But the theories are derived from observing people within material conditions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that having been said, let's do some storytelling.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a story of humanity that incorporates material conditions that exists within the realm of anthropology. This is not facts. This is theory. This is anthropological theory, but it's theory that you should know about. And as theory, this is like pretty zoomed out, right? So it's talking about the general trends. Humans emerge on the scene as hunter-gatherers. Humans emerge on the scene, the dates vary, but Homo erectus comes about like something like 2.5 million years ago. Anatomically modern humans, which are called Homo sapiens in the taxonomy of primates, maybe 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. Humans emerge on the scene as hunter-gatherers. Okay, like hunter-gatherer is this special term of anthropology, but really it just means a way of living without domesticated animals or plants, without having agriculture, herding, domesticated animals, even horticulture, right? We know that humans emerged as hunter-gatherers because every animal basically is a hunter-gatherer. Like spiders are hunter-gatherers, bisons are hunter-gatherers, just in this sense of like a critter that moves about the earth, foraging from its environment in some way, hunting, foraging plants, humans did all of this. Humans emerge on the scene as hunter-gatherers. And we have reason to believe that humans as hunter-gatherers were mostly egalitarian. And we're definitely going to get into that a lot deeper in a few minutes. But the archaeological evidence shows that most people during this long couple million year span of time lived as nomadic game hunters. So that means that they would move around the landscape in bands that could never be that big while people were moving around and hunting. So that would be like having a camp and being there for a while, but then pulling up camp and moving around. People like this way of life because big game hunting, hunting large animals and supplementing that with plants from the environment and other things that you could forage turns out to be like the most efficient way of making a living as far as like return on your work efforts, and so people choose that if they can do it. And people still, in a lot of conditions all over the world now, choose that if they can do it. You get the most free time that way. And it also has some side benefits that help provide more of the material conditions for egalitarian relations. And by that, we mean like just the material conditions that prevent individuals from getting power over other people. So one of them is being on the move all the time. And so that means that you are not carrying around very much property and you're not carrying around stored food or anything like that either. Also, the composition of these groups could shift frequently, which was really beneficial for these folks too, because it meant that like if you were having a conflict or there was somebody in your group that you didn't like, you could just leave and go join another group. Right. For a long time, it was actually thought, anthropologically speaking, that these hunter-gatherer bands were made up of closely related individuals. But then when people started looking more closely and spending more time with these people, they found out that no, actually, there was a lot of unrelated individuals in the group, and that the composition of the group was shifting all the time. And so you can imagine that if it's easy to just check out of a situation where somebody is maybe getting too big for their britches or whatever, then it's harder for people to get trapped in hierarchies in a situation like that.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because if someone's like gaining power and you think they're a jerk and a whole group of you could leave.
Or someone's really violent.
Or if someone's violent, then you would have the capacity to get out of there or just to be like, actually, me and everyone that thinks you're a jerk is leaving, you know?
Right.
And also I wanted to say that when your life is made from moving around and gathering food and living together, you have those skills, so you can leave and do that on your own until you find other people.
Exactly.
You know?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And we also have stuff like, at a certain point in the evolution of like tool use, there was lethal weaponry that was available to people. And so that meant that the strong, like the physically biggest and strongest people, didn't automatically get to dominate everybody else because they could be taken out maybe from a distance with a bow and arrow or a spear. Or something, right? And then people at a certain point started to use poisons as well, and all of this is in far prehistory. All of this is happening, but it's part of the conditions that helped prevent durable hierarchies from forming. Now, not all hunter-gatherers live in these conditions. Like there are sedentary hunter-gatherers as well. Some of the most famous of these are people who live off of like abundant fish, and they have a territory basically that they inhabit, and they just get to live well off of, the salmon like running in the streams or something, right? And through a material lens in anthropology, we can think about these different strategies of hunter-gatherism as being composed from different material conditions. And in fact, there was an anthropologist named James Woodburn, I want to say, who came up with a well-known schema back in the 20th century of what he called immediate return hunter-gatherers versus delayed return hunter-gatherers. So these are very academic sounding terms, but basically the immediate return hunter-gatherers are people who they basically consume what they gather and hunt for, like right away, without really elaborate processing or storage happening. And then there's the delayed return hunter-gatherers. They still don't have domesticated livestock. They still don't have farming or like anything like it. But their way of life is dependent on maybe being more sedentary or relying on some sustenance in their environment that's maybe seasonal, and so it has to be preserved, right? And we see one of the patterns that is noticed in anthropology is that it's the immediate return hunter-gatherers that tend to have these hyper-egalitarian relations. And we can think through a material lens, we can think about why this might be the case. Because if you're storing food, even if it's not grain that you grew in your farmer's fields or something, if you're storing food, if you're like smoking the fish or something and you have storage of this, then now for one thing, you have a surplus that needs to be apportioned out to people. And then there's politics around the distribution of the stored wealth and like the guarding of it and, just all of that. And then so whenever there's like politics at that level, then there's an opportunity for people to get the upper hand or to get themselves into like long-term positions of authority or control of the resource. It also gives your group a vulnerability because people might come and try and steal your stuff, right?
All right, so you have to defend it.
So you have to defend it. And whenever defense of a resource comes into the picture, we'll get into this a little more in a couple minutes, but then that's another setup for hierarchy.
Maybe especially gender hierarchy?
Maybe especially gender hierarchy,
right.
Yeah. And there have actually been very careful studies of African hunter-gatherers, not in prehistory, but in contemporary times, that show that women actually lose status and freedom in those cultures if they become more sedentary. And there's a lot of dynamics that go on there, but one of them has to do with just people being able to avail themselves of like more sophisticated support networks and social networks. If you're on the move all the time in a habitat that's being traversed by a lot of these bands, if you're a woman who's having a hard time in the group that you're with, then you can bail
Right.
and go to where some of your relatives, like your brothers and sisters, are at, or your mother or somebody, you know, and get more support from them that way. And that becomes less possible with sedentary life, apparently. So immediate return, hunter-gatherer lifestyle creates some pretty favorable material conditions for avoiding dominance hierarchies, right? And for an egalitarian type of life. We've got, lethal weapons, nomadism, the ability to leave and join a new group all the time, the lack of property to be defended or a surplus to be apportioned out. Those are some pretty good material conditions. And we talked about delayed return hunter-gatherers, where some of those conditions start to shift and to break down. And in settled delayed return hunter-gatherers, we do actually historically start to see the emergence of some different kinds of political forms. But before we go on, I just want you to notice what is missing from this account of hunter-gatherer egalitarianism. And what's missing is innocence, right? These people are not innocent of power dynamics. They just live in a situation that favors the power dynamics not getting too out of hand, right? Including the willingness to maybe kill a guy who's trying to become like an alpha male.
Right.
For instance, you know, right? And like a history maybe of having done this to further your desire to not be dominated, you know? So I just want to bring that up because Graeber and Wengrow seem to think, I mean, they told us at the end of chapter 2 that if you talk about egalitarian origins of humanity, then you are talking about innocence, right? I mean, that was in there. And also the myth of the stupid savage.
I was going to say
These people are
it's actually
stupid.
worse than innocence because it's stupidity, and with their meaning of stupidity being like not smart enough to even think about power or the consequences or to choose.
Yeah, so I ask you, listener, if this looks like stupidity and innocence to you, you know, I just don't see it. And they were not ignorant of this scholarship. This is, well, you know, so anyway, it's frustrating. I just wish that they made a better argument against it than the one that they do. Like, I want to hear what they have to say, but be fair. And make a better argument. You can do better than what you did, I think, in this book. So one really fascinating example of how a change in material conditions actually creates different power relations is one that happens in the condition of people adopting a life way of nomadic pastoralism, which is where they have herds of livestock that they like manage and move around the landscape with their herds. And once again, I owe Daniel from What is Politics for this really good example, which I'm just going to use here. So this is an example of materialist anthropology at work. So basically what this is about is that once you have a herd of animals that are not just wild, but you keep them together and, you know, you cull from them sometimes and you take care of them. And now you have something to defend, right? You have something to defend, and it's relatively easy for people from the outside to make a raid and run off with some of your livestock, right? And because of this, people very naturally and understandably organized to defend against such raids. And for various reasons, most of which have to do with women spending a lot of their time occupied with biological reproduction at this time period, the men of the group are more likely to be able to form the defensive force. And not just any men, but what makes the best defensive force is a group of closely related males who have grown up together and trust each other and can work well together. And so because of these pressures, the males who grow up in a community together are encouraged to stay together, right? And so that means that when they, you know, get married or whatever, quote unquote, that they're not going to leave the group to go and live with their wife's community because they need to stay at home to help form this defensive force with their brothers and cousins and stuff, right? And so that means that what has to happen instead is that it's the women who move around. So the women have to leave the community where they grew up and they travel and marry into this community of allied brothers and cousins of males. And that is called in anthropology, patrilocal residence is what that's called. That's the technical term for that. And what it means practically is that the women in a given group are isolated from their allies and the people who they grew up with. Both their brothers and their sisters and their mother, like all of this. And the other women who they are living with are people who are relatively new to them, who came from different groups and communities from around, whereas the men are a closely bonded allied force of brothers and cousins and uncles and stuff. And so this is a recipe for male dominance.
It's also a recipe for misogyny because when you have, which, you're probably going to get to this, but what you're describing in these situations, which also happen in rural agricultural places around the world or within communities around the world that have settlement and live rurally. Wherever there's a lineage, wherever there's the tradition of the women having, or girls in some cases, having to go to other places to marry. Then often what comes with that is a hearty tradition of mother-in-laws hating their daughter-in-laws. And there often, you'll hear a lot about the violence that can come with this, say like in India or in rural parts of China, in which there these daughters that go off to marry end up getting treated like shit, and because they're outsiders, and also just because in a place where defense is so important, the labor that does that defense gain power and status, which means there's a decrease in status for the people who are not doing that work. And they don't have and they don't have like their strong networks and allies and all of those things. But anytime you read about cultures where that pattern happens,
where there's patrilocal residence, where the wife or whatever it's called, goes to live with the community of her husband. Right.
Then there's often this pattern of misogyny that develops.
If you follow this downstream, like Janet's talking about, and the pattern just continues, and in some cases it actually intensifies to like outright misogyny. Like women experience misogyny at home from their parents, even too.
Oh, right, because their parents know the kid's going to leave anyway, so they don't want to get too attached. They don't invest much in them.
There's a whole fascinating conversation around all of this, but I'm bringing this up partially because this is an example. This is a very well documented pattern of what happens when patrilocal residence emerges in the context of nomadic pastoral herding cultures. And apparently, this is not my research, but apparently you can go all over the world to where there's nomadic pastoralists and they all have male dominance.
Right. And so what Graeber and Wingrove would be worried about is that we're going to be determinist and say that pastoral communities will necessarily become male-dominated.
Right. And so what's the answer to that? What I'm trying to focus on here is the past, right? And we're telling history, right? And so this is what the history kind of has been, and these are the patterns that have showed up. The extent to which these conditions are deterministic now is a whole other question. It definitely does not mean that you must have male dominance if you are a nomadic pastoralist. I don't think it means that. It means that it sets you up for that. And so you better have some pretty good other things in place to counteract that pressure. And what would that be, right? So that's where you have to start thinking. That's where you have to start making history, not under conditions of your own choosing. Right. And so that's the work, right? So patrilocal residence turns out to be a really important thing. I think it's fair to say that whenever something needs to be defended, then this is a risk. Then male dominance is a risk. And now I can see the sympathy for feminists who want reproduction to happen in like a test tube or a vat or something, or like to have there be, a womb that's like a artificial womb, because part of what we're seeing here is that it's like, the women are not part of the fighting force, partially because they are the sex whose job it is to reproduce more people. And they're just spending a lot of their time and energy doing that.
Right.
And if they're 8 months pregnant or something, then they're not maybe going to be recruited into a force like this, right? Anyway, it's just, there's lots of directions you can go from thinking about this. One thing that I want to say just really quickly before we leave this topic is that like there is reason to believe, and we'll get to this kind of at the end, that matrilocal residence, if anything, was more common and maybe the norm in the far Paleolithic, in far prehistory. And, this is where a woman stays with her family and her mother. And whenever you see matrilocal residence, it is potentially a bulwark against male dominance. It's harder to accomplish in that condition, right? So here we are. This is what it's like to talk about material conditions.
Right.
Okay. And, whether you accept these types of frameworks or you reject them, this is what it sounds like. Now, to talk a little bit more about not just patterns, but about history and kind of moving forward in history. And again, we're talking about the actual history that actually happened, not like what could happen in the future, whatever, but just kind of what happened. Because the question emerges, and this is, partially a question directly of this book, is, like what happened, right? How did we get stuck is the way that they put it. And if for a couple million years, it was real common to have egalitarian relations as part of your life as a hunter-gatherer, then how did that even change? And as far as I understand, here's one theory about how that stuff began to change. And it ties into what's going to happen in the next chapter and in some more of the book. But one theory is that it has to do with the material conditions of humans, especially the humans who left Africa. And that's a whole nother thing we could talk about, the migrations of humans out of Africa, when they happened, blah, blah, blah. But before the arrival of the Holocene, which was, what happened after the Ice Age, right? The retreating of the ice caps. We live in the Holocene now, or maybe we live in the Anthropocene. But the Holocene was the climatically stable, warmer, and wetter period, for the last about 10,000 years. In the previous conditions of the Pleistocene, the weather was really unstable, and there would be long periods of like relative stability and greater warmth, and then it would get like drier or colder again, and there was this flip-flop, like the weather was prone to all these different flip-flops, and not like over weeks. We're talking about over like generations, even. And what people potentially see happening in these situations, which would be more common in temperate climates than in like the equatorial, more like what we call tropical climates of Africa, would be that in good periods of time, people could live easy. There was plenty of game, and this nomadic hunter-gatherer life would be more available to people. And then if the climate clamped down, then it was no longer easy for everybody to still live that way. And so people then were pressured to adopt, or some people, not all people, but some people, if they were caught in a particularly bad spot or something, were pressured to adopt one of these less favorable modes of subsistence. The technical term for this is intensification. The intensification of foraging or subsistence. So, instead of following game around, you find like a lake that has a lot of really good fish in it, and you set up a village on the edge of the lake, and you make your living, from some hunting, but you have to like supplement and pivot more towards getting a lot of fish out of the lake, let's say. And then maybe when the climate warms up again, and things get better, then you can move away from the lake and start like running around and hunting big game again. But during these periods of intensification, you see people, they become more sedentary. So some of these power differentials are more likely to form in these like interstitial periods where people are kind of pushed into intensification. And actually, agriculture is one of these intensification modes, like basically.
Right.
It's another option that people can turn to for intensification for a harder, like more laborious, less ideal way of getting by, but that people might adopt if other ways of life aren't possible for them, And so part of the implication of this is that you don't have to think that people just discovered the possibility of agriculture in the Neolithic with the beginning of like farming as we know it, that was when people discovered that plants grew from seeds and that you could grow things in that way. It's maybe something that people always knew was possible, but they had all these other ways of living that were preferable. But then when environmental conditions or, it's environmental, it's social, it's all these things coalesce into something that favors an intensification strategy, then people will do that because the other options are to starve or to like go to war against your neighbors and try and take their stuff.
Right.
Basically. And humans leaving Africa in the latest wave going into Europe and Western Asia is like, 50, 60,000 years ago, something like that. So it's around this time period and in the years after that, leading into what they call the Upper Paleolithic, like the end of the Paleolithic, before the advent of widespread agriculture and all this stuff, that you start to see these various intensification strategies emerge because people were, and they're more likely to emerge in these like more polar, more marginal ecological contexts than in Africa.
Right.
Too. So people were, yes, experimenting with intensification, with being settled, with doing agriculture. It was a conscious experimentation, but it was a conscious experimentation that was potentially, according to these types of theories, formed by the climate of the Upper Paleolithic.
Well, there were pressures.
And the places where they were living and the pressures that were formed by all of that.
Right.
And then once the Ice Age ends and we move into the Holocene, where it's a wetter climate, it's warmer, the earth just becomes more abundant, there's more animals, there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All of these conditions make stable agriculture more possible.
Right.
Like long-term agricultural settlements that last for longer than just a generation or two before the next, clamp down happens with the glacial sheets or something. So agriculture becomes more environmentally kind of attractive as an option as we get into the Holocene. And then so you see people start experimenting with more of it. And then once agriculture takes hold, and this is skipping over a lot of history, but it's just the trends, right? And then once agriculture takes hold, then the populations of these settlements that are powered by agriculture can increase really rapidly. Because especially grain agriculture is really good at just producing lots of calories, which can really fuel a booming population. And then the populations of like agricultural civilizations and cities can grow way faster than all of the other people on the earth. And then you start to see the rise of the actual dominance of agricultural populations.
Well, yeah, and it's like this interesting loop, though, because also like it's so much more labor intensive, and so you require more people to get it done, And so like you can make more people because you have more calories, but you also need more people.
Yeah, right. There's like a cycle, like a vicious cycle in there, or a self-reinforcing cycle, I think. Yeah. And then of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves in time period here, but grain states are sitting ducks for being raided by nomads. Come in and just take everything that's been stored. So now you have armies and you have like defensive fortifications and all this other conditions that, among other things, encourage male dominance, but also elaborate hierarchies,
right,
and things like that too.
Well, this brings something up for me, and it's related to what I think is like the valid critique from Graeber and Wingrove of stagism, right? Where human society moves through these stages necessarily, and they're progressive, and one builds on the other, and they kind of have to happen that way.
Yeah.
And I guess, maybe that's part of the reason they're avoiding all this stuff is because it starts to smell like that a lot, or it's too resonant with that concept. And so I guess I'm wondering, is there a way we can parse it out? Because the evidence seems pretty convincing that this is a pattern, and that settlement is a precondition to hierarchy. Dominance is a precondition to some forms of hierarchy and dominance showing up.
Let's say it's often a precondition.
It's often a precondition. Yeah. And that if you're looking at historical trends and societies and different groups of people, you often see certain patterns emerge, but is there a way we can talk about that without making it seem like it has to go that way?
Yeah, that's a really important endeavor, I think, to do. The main reason why stagism is even a threat is because we have this history.
Right.
You can't say that the history didn't happen. Well, maybe that's what this book is trying to do.
I think they might be saying that. I mean,
they do and they don't. I mean, they do acknowledge in the book. Yeah, the book is a little bit ambivalent. They say the history is not as clear as we think.
Right.
Let's muddy up some of the oversimplification of a stagist story.
Right.
But in other moments in the book, they'll hedge and say, they will even pose the question, they'll say, but didn't things still kind of move in this direction over time, though?
Right.
And what does it mean to notice that or whatever, right? So they're not even trying to say that, states didn't come after farming or something. They did. But, what does it mean? The what does it mean is the bigger question. And, this roughly is what I just said is kind of roughly a story of how it happened. To be clear too, though, some of I think especially the part about intensification being more common in the Upper Paleolithic after humans moved into Europe and Asia is maybe a little more speculative.
Right. Definitely.
But it's a speculative thing that fills in kind of a gap in the story in a way that sounds plausible to people. But a lot of this other stuff, like nomadic pastoralism, giving rise to male dominance, is something that's pretty well documented. There's a lot of evidence for, and there's a lot of evidence for egalitarianism in the deep Paleolithic as well. But here's a couple things. So stagism, though, is the theory that the stages are linear and irreversible.
Right.
But we know there's a lot, the Davids are very into this type of thing, what I'm about to say. There's a lot of examples of people who went back to an earlier stage, quote unquote, in stagism. People who were agricultural and then became hunter-gatherers again, right? So I think that one way out of this is to separate out just the different modes that people can live in and modes of subsistence and what that has to say about their sociality. Separating out the modes from a more linear one-way stagist way of organizing those modes and hierarchical, right? Because for Turgot to move towards agriculture and then civilization is to move up the ladder out of barbarism and savagery, and is to more fully realize our human potential.
Right.
Is what's implied in that, but we can ditch that and still talk about different ways of life and what they imply politically.
And how one can kind of set you up for another.
Yeah.
But doesn't have to. I mean, I think that is...
Right.
It's the inevitability of stagism that we want to push up against, while also looking with clear eyes at the evidence for certain forms very regularly leading to certain forms of domination.
Yeah. And the question, still needs to be answered, kind of if our concern is history, then it does beg the question of why did things unfold in the way that they did?
Right.
If it's not inevitable, if the state is not inevitable, then why is almost every square inch of land on the planet occupied by a state now?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a rhetorical question, like, obviously the state is inevitable. That's not what I mean. But, like, how did that happen then?
Mm-hmm.
You know? And to look into the mechanisms for why something like that could have ever happened, and some of the theories that I was just talking about, like states can outbreed the hunter-gatherers that are next to them or whatever, you know, all this stuff produces a kind of knowledge that can be used for us now in trying to recreate our freedom.
Right.
You know, or to just create a better world, for lack of a better term. Yeah, but just because things happened in an overall sequence in history, in the big picture, like the view from space or something, does not mean that things have to go in that order. You know, like you can tell the history of evolution of life on Earth by being like, first there were unicellular organisms, and then there were multicellular organisms all in the ocean, and then life crawled out of the ocean onto land and evolved into more complex forms, and then there were primates, and then there were humans, and you put humans at like the top or the end of the scale or something. And then, you know, for animals to be land animals and then decide to go live in the sea again, according to that rubric or whatever, seems like a reversal. It's going backwards against the flow. But the example of that is all the cetaceans and the dolphins and the whales. And there's nothing backwards about what they did. It's just something different. They just chose to go here now, you know, and it was still available for them to do that. Right. So these are like we need to learn how to see the pathways that are open to us. Given the conditions that we're in.
Right.
And the argument is that a materialist lens helps us to be smarter about seeing what pathways are open to us.
I mean, I think I am getting to what Graeber and Wingrove are afraid of and what's making them avoid engaging directly with this content.
Yeah.
And engaging directly with materialism or a materialist perspective on this.
Yeah.
And it's that if you look at the material conditions that we are living in on most of the globe right now, and if we also think like we can't, if you're holding that recognition at the same time as you might think that if we look at history and look at the anthropological evidence that hierarchies and forms of domination are much less likely to arise in a very narrow band of ways of living.
Yeah.
And you put those together. Right. That's upsetting.
Yeah.
So I understand how they might want to say, well, let's just not talk about it that way and ignore it. Right. And so I guess like our job, listeners' jobs, people of Earth's job is how do we think of ways to live in right relationship with Earth and with each other with the awareness that we can't actually survive or that we can't actually choose a path of foraging and hunting entirely as a large group because of the material conditions of Earth, including how many people are here. Yeah. You know, so, and the amount of land that's even possible to have that relationship with.
That's not the way.
So I guess it's resistance to that equation that drives the book. Yeah. So to be able to hold material conditions as absolutely essential to creating a path forward. Yeah. While also trying to move away from thinking that right relationship can only happen in these very specific conditions.
Yeah. It's a humdinger. Yeah. You know? Yeah. And like I said at the beginning, I don't think anyone's arguing for a strictly material perspective. But it's arguable, I guess, that these folks would argue that if you discount material conditions entirely, then you'll end up wasting energy or making bad decisions. Right. You'll like not be aware how an action might fail because of this, that, or the other thing. And I do want to say that the hunter-gatherer specialists that I've been studying, there's a number of them from what's called the Radical Anthropology group, which I think they're centered in London. Anthropologists like Chris Knight, Camilla Power, Morna Finnegan, they believe in egalitarian origins, and they do not think that we're doomed. to misery and unfreedom because of it.
Right.
They in fact think that egalitarianism is actually what our bodies and minds are designed for and where we thrive, and that we need to figure out a way to recreate those conditions. I don't know that much about like a anthropological way of imagining what the conditions in contemporary times would be like. That would be a fun thing to try and come up with, but I think it has to do with abundance.
Yeah.
There are, like, of all the things that are wrong with the earth right now, that are wrong with humans on the earth and what we've done to the earth, arguably, there are material conditions for abundance of resources. And that if utilized in a different way, so for not for profiteering, but if utilized in a collective way, then we could ensure the kind of material abundance of needed things that would be one of the important preconditions for a less hierarchical way of life. Yeah.
So kind of just to draw out something that you're saying to maybe make it a little more clear would be to say that scarcity does not create good conditions for egalitarianism, or scarcity goes hand in hand with forms of domination. And in fact, we could argue in the world we live in right now that scarcity is created and enforced to ensure that the systems of domination stay in power.
Yeah.
And so if we were to create a future and a vision in which we were able to dismantle that and make a world that did not have systems of domination, or that level of systems of domination, then we would need to think about how can we actually access the abundance that is possible on Earth.
Yeah.
And create systems of abundance rather than systems of scarcity.
Right.
And I think that is a helpful way for me to think about this. And we see that kind of thread and discussion happening in a lot of different places right now. Right. Even if it's not tied to this story.
Right. Yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Deer at dusk, buzzard at dawn, big old frog singing in the pond. Earth wakes up. Deer at dusk, buzzard at dawn, big old frog singing in the pond. Earth wakes up. Earth wakes up. Middle of a dream. 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 Deer at dusk, buzzard at dawn, big old frog singing in the pond. Earth wakes up. Time to feel. Time to feel. Time to We feel the land, it touches back, a song recalled from distant past. Earth wakes up. Earth wakes up. Earth wakes up.
Okay, so that was all really interesting. That was a very big, extended overview of a lot of these big picture themes and big picture history. And for this last part, I do want to like zero in on some of the more specific work done by some of these anthropologists who I've been referring to. Because I think that a lot of this is really super interesting.
Yeah.
And it basically gets at the question of why people, like deeper into the question of why people think that humans were mostly egalitarian. Notice I'm saying mostly. Mostly egalitarian for a few 100,000 years. Because it's not just that, well, the conditions provided for that. You know, there's actually more than that. So we already talked about the social mobility, the freedom to leave, the lack of surplus, the lack of a need to form a defense force of any kind, the presence of lethal weapons, all this stuff. But there's a book that I've been reading by Christopher Boehm, and it's called Hierarchy in the Forest. This is a pretty well-known book. I think it came out in 1999. And Boehm has done a lot of really careful research and some field work, and also builds on the work of some people who came before him in trying to kind of, one of the things that the book does is it gets at this question, which has been talked about in The Dawn of Everything already, kind of about human nature. If hunter-gatherers were mostly egalitarian for a few 100,000 years, is it because it's in our nature to be kind and altruistic and not want to dominate people? You know? And Boehm, maybe unsurprisingly to me, comes up with a set of observations and a theory or whatever that says, like, no, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Right.
It's actually a lot more complicated than that. What seems to be true, and this is from, you know, this is from cumulative observation of immediate return hunter-gatherers, delayed return hunter-gatherers, even nomadic pastoralists, even agricultural people. There's lots of different types of modes of subsistence and ways of life, and people from all parts of the globe and stuff that are included in this analysis. He says that it seems to be that people all over the world seem to have two somewhat conflicting desires within them. One of them is a desire to have advantages for themselves. Like a lot of people, when given the opportunity to take an advantage, like an advantage over others, they will accept that opportunity. But there's another desire, and that is the desire not to be dominated. The desire not to be dominated. Right? And without presenting just the real fine-grained detail of the theory and of all of the evidence, basically where Boehm arrives is at the conclusion that there are always going to be some people who seek to dominate others, but the desire not to be dominated, given appropriate conditions, will win out at the end of the day. Because humans who don't want to be dominated effectively form coalitions. Against the bullies and the upstarts, as Boehm calls them, and the people and the would-be alphas in the group. And that this coalition forming is something that, you know, he tracks this in a lot of detail. You see it in embryonic form, kind of, in chimpanzees, and a little bit in bonobos, but it becomes really pronounced in humans. And in fact, there's like a parallel theory that correlates the size of the human brain, which is very large compared to like a chimpanzee. I think we have 4 times the size of a chimpanzee's brain and similar body weight. You know, that correlates the size of the human brain to the ability to sort of hold the social world and manage the social world. Like, this is called the social brain theory. And that we need these big brains in order to be able to manage this like social reality that includes forming sophisticated and ever-shifting political coalitions to prevent the emergence of alphas and upstarts. Now, of course, the upstarts and the would-be dominators can themselves form coalitions for the purpose of dominating. But given the presence of anti-authoritarian coalitions, it'll always turn out to be a better strategy in the long run for a bully to give up trying to be an alpha and to settle for not being dominated. And the evidence for this is complex, and I think it actually involves some mathematics and like some game theory type of research, in there, but it matches the evidence.
Right.
The theory matches the evidence. And so that results in a condition that Christopher Boehm calls reverse dominance, or sometimes it's been called counter dominance, where actually it's not a culture that has no dominance dynamics, but it's actually dominated by the egalitarians. It's dominated by the anti-authoritarians, kind of. And to say this is to stress that it's not without conflict, because there's always people who kind of get a little bit of a big head, get a little boastful, tries to dominate women more, try to do something. And these people are aggressively shamed and ridiculed. In fact, there's all these practices of like preemptive ridicule, like even if a hunter just comes back with like a really impressive kill or something and is kind of like strutting about it, there's all these ethnographic accounts of how the people will just spend the whole like rest of the day talking about what a puny animal that was and how bad a job he did and stuff and make fun of him, and it's this leveling thing, right? Where he's not allowed to he's not going to get his ego fed something, right? In that situation. So the upstarts are shamed, they're ridiculed, they're sometimes ostracized, and not infrequently, they're murdered. Not infrequently in the, 2 million year history.
Like just an upstart or someone who's like especially
maybe
terrible?
Someone who's especially violent.
Okay.
Yeah, right. So there's a degree. I mean, I'm just assuming. I don't know. I wasn't there. But I'm assuming that that things would maybe have to get to a certain point before you get killed. I don't know. I mean, but also every situation is its own situation. We're just talking about kind of the averages or something here. And part of the evidence for that is actually in the way that our bodies look now. Like primates who have a lot of male dominance that relies on violence and males fighting with other males for supremacy and fighting over females, the male bodies, there's evolutionary pressures, natural selection pressures for the male bodies to be built for fighting. So you have like the really heavy brow ridges over the eyes that are designed to sustain blows to the head and still survive them. And you have males that are like significantly larger than the females and things like that. With baboons, the males have these canine teeth like that are really fierce and everything. And you don't see any of that with modern humans. And, one of the ways we can imagine this happening is that the males that had more of those features and were more aggressive and more prone to fighting were killed. They were removed from the gene pool. I'm sure that's not the only thing that accounts for this, but we can think about it usefully from a natural selection lens too. We're actually not built for the kind of like extreme ultraviolence that was kind of the norm with some of our primate relatives. And there's also kind of an important addendum to the Christopher Boehm thing, which is that like there's kind of a chicken or the egg type of question here about, do these communities have an egalitarian ethos that leads them to form these coalitions against being dominated? Or do the coalitions lead to the ethos? And maybe it doesn't matter. But there's a way that this has been told. And this actually gets into a little bit of the Camilla Power reading that I've been doing and that I want to talk about next. But where once this counter-dominant situation is in place, where the bullies are controlled and the upstarts are put down so that the rest of the people can not be dominated, then it's actually possible to make those values a part of your culture. And then so you get stories and rules and things that call for people to basically be good people. and not dominate others. But rules like that would never emerge, probably, unless the counter-dominants got the upper hand first, right? Because then they're dominating, so they get to make the rules, right? And people who just rule by violence, they don't really need to make rules. You either do things their way or you get beat up. But where another way emerges that's more egalitarian, where the bullies are kept in their place, now we have the precondition for there to be stories that get told and embedded in the culture that emphasizes the reciprocity of life, not taking too much, getting consent, all of these type of things that, to varying extents form some of the stories that people tell all over the world and the mythologies and the religious kind of ideas, and part of the argument for egalitarian origins is that like the fact that we even have these stories is evidence that the bullies didn't rule for most of the time. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I can't say this is like definitive proof or anything like that, but I like hearing these stories. Like I like hearing this theorization. It really makes me think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last thing I want to talk about in some detail, and in this I'm drawing from the primatologist and evolutionary biologist Sarah Hrdy, and I'm drawing substantially from an article by Camilla Power that I'll link to called Gender Egalitarianism Made Us Human. And I'm going to put some other links in the show note here too. But there's a lot of theory that has emerged that is a mix of evolutionary biology, so like using Darwinian natural selection concepts with anthropology that lends more evidence for the egalitarian origins of humans. One thing that's really fascinating that Camilla Power points out is, she says it's still common for people to think about people who use Darwinian natural selection, evolutionary biology, that's kind of like a fundamentally conservative or maybe even a racist practice to choose to focus on that way of looking at things. But she points out that evolutionary biology has actually taken a very strong feminist turn, and that the strategies of women and mothers are really being looked at as extremely foundational to the way that, just to take our own species, humans have actually become what they are.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because natural selection has this really strong association with social Darwinism.
Yes.
And even though that was not Charles Darwin's thing at all.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so like the Darwinians have had to work really hard to like almost like police the boundaries or something of the discipline and be like, this is what this is about. It's not about what these other people are doing.
Totally, right.
And to be able to hold space.
Right.
Maybe that's a better way of saying than police the boundaries, but like to hold space for what's actually valuable and is not racist.
Right.
About it. Yeah.
But then also an interesting thing that came to light, more for me at least, in the past 10 years was that Charles Darwin had this whole other theory of selection pressure that had to do with mate selection. And Richard Prum talks about this in The Evolution of Beauty.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping you were going to talk about this.
And there was basically, I think, and I talked about this maybe in another podcast, another season. I don't even remember what the reference point was then. Anyway, Darwin was always just like, but why peacocks? Like, he lost sleep over peacocks. He's just like, this makes no sense. It's not advantageous. They have this ostentatious tail. It actually makes them more likely to die because they can't get away. It doesn't help them fly.
Yeah.
It's purely for show. Like, what is this?
It doesn't help them get food. It doesn't help them get away from predators. It actually hurts for all those things.
Absolutely. And you can see many examples of that in birds, like so many different bird patterns of plumage, of how to even find a mate. There's a million examples of that.
Yeah.
But then also you'll see these kinds of non-advantageous presentations, even if it's like a really big claw on certain kinds of crabs, that's mostly for waving to find a mate.
Yeah.
But they don't actually use to even fight each other or anything,
Yeah.
Whatever. There's a lot of examples in the animal world of strange traits that don't really make sense from a fitness standpoint, right?
Right.
And so what Darwin argued in his other work that was lesser known, partially because of the implications, is that actually females of all of these different species are huge determinants in the course of evolution and the course of trait selection, because they have various preferences that might not even be advantageous, and sometimes are actually can be the opposite and can lead to maladaptive patterns in their genomes.
And historically, evolutionary biologists have tried to find a way that these traits could signify better fitness in some more strictly Darwinian type of way. Like maybe the guy with the really big claw is actually, he's that way because he's better fed or something. And if he's better fed, it means that he's a better forager or hunter or something. And so I want that to be the daddy or whatever. But these have fallen apart time and time again.
Well, especially since some of the traits actually aren't bad for the species. Sometimes, right. There are examples of that. We can link to that book too, because it is pretty interesting. I think there's even a Radiolab episode about that as well. But
and it turns out that the females, they just like this trait. Right. They think it's hot or something. You know, they think that guy with the plumage is like, that's pretty, you know? Or that's like the evolution of beauty, or like, oh, look at the claw on that guy.
Or with like the Bowery birds or some of the other birds that have like have to build these very complicated ritual enclosures to do their little dance in. There's evidence that a lot of that is helping protect the females from coerced copulation. Yeah. And so these birds have these elaborate rituals that the males have to do so that the females actually get to have more say about who they mate with.
Yeah. So fascinating.
And so that actually is like directly related to this to this anthropology, because a good bit of it has to do with consent.
Yeah, that's true. So we get this emphasis on females driving evolution in a lot of these various ways, and driving culture. So to get into this with regards to humans and human origins, let's see if I can explain this adequately, because it is kind of complicated. But Sarah Hrdy, the primatologist, has this theory that involves, well, you know how a little bit ago I was talking about humans having big brains, right? Humans have big brains. And big brains are not only enable us to like process, you know, this kind of social information or whatever it could be, but they're also expensive. Big brains are expensive. I think Camilla Power says they're nice if you can get them, but they're expensive, you know, and it's not very common in the web of life for these to exist, partially because they're metabolically very expensive. And so what we have with Sarah Hrdy and some of the theory that I'm about to get into here is this idea that I guess what it's driven by is humans are emerging as a big-brained species, and part of what enables that, but it also kind of feeds back into it, is cooperative childcare. And these observations come partly from observing other primates. Most other primates, especially the great apes, we are great apes, you know, but the other great apes, the mothers don't let their babies go. Childcare is not shared. The mothers just will not let their babies go.
By that you mean like they hold on to them all the time? Physically? Okay.
Yeah, they physically hold on to them. And a mother primate who's trying to forage and provision food for herself and her offspring at the same time can really only, this is how this theory goes, can really only gather enough food and resources to afford a certain size brain in her offspring. But that once cooperative childcare gets into the picture, and I don't think anyone is really theorizing how it gets into the picture, but once it enters the picture, then you have the possibility of resources being gathered and to provision children a lot more robustly, nutritionally, to create the conditions that allow for the emergence of these bigger brains. And we're going to need those bigger brains partly to navigate the social world of cooperation, that the big brains are built for cooperation at the same time as they're enabled by cooperation, right? So this is like a evolutionary pathway that we start going down, where more cooperation, especially in child rearing, more cooperation leads to better provisioned, more well-fed children, which can feed into, just greater health. Like, we're focusing on the brains here because it has to do with consciousness and stuff. The bigger brains, and then that enables our scope of cooperation to be greater as well. And coalition forming, like we talked about with the Christopher Bohm stuff and all of that. And there's evidence for cooperative childcare actually being a feature of early humanity. For one thing, it's a feature of humanity. Period. Right? Cooperative childcare is a feature of humanity. I mean, it maybe not in every single instance, but anthropologists can go all around the world and find cooperative childcare in almost every context. And even in, the alienated industrial West, like we have daycares and things like this where cooperative childcare exists, or people have employees, that do the childcare.
Yeah, or just intergenerational family
Intergenerational, which relates to something that we're going to talk about in a minute. Yeah.
Can I just clarify so that I know we're all getting this? Yeah, by cooperative childcare, you just mean anyone but the biological mother caring for the young.
Yeah.
Anyone.
Yeah.
We aren't talking about fathers as much.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the other great apes, the fathers aren't really part of the childcare.
Totally. Right. Okay.
They just want to mate.
Right.
And then that's it.
Okay.
But with humans, you have this more complex network of childcare.
Right.
Yeah. So we can see cooperative childcare happening. Camilla Power mentions that if you're hanging out with, say, a nomadic hunter-gatherer band in Africa, and when a child is born, within hours after the child's birth, that child has been held by many people in the group of all sexes and not just blood relatives. Just within hours, right? That's like one of the first things that happens. Another thing that gets pointed out, which is kind of interesting and strange, is humans have what are called cooperative eyes. And what this means is that we have eyes that are very expressive. They seem designed for what's called intersubjectivity, to be able to sort of read the mind of another, and likewise to be able to intuit each other's thoughts. The other great apes mostly have just big black eyes, where in humans we have what's called the sclera of the eye, which is white. That's like the white ball of the eyeball. And then within the sclera is the iris and the pupil, right? And because there's a lot of contrast between the pupil iris and the sclera, you can see where somebody is looking, and you can just read things from their expression, like their eye darts back and forth, or their eyes do this or that or the other thing. And with the other great apes, you don't have that. It's like they're wearing sunglasses. Like, you can't see who they're looking at. And it's a lot harder to intuitively kind of read into their mind. And the argument from the sociobiological standpoint is that the great ape style of just all dark eyes is more adapted for domination and less adapted for cooperation, because you don't want to reveal what you're thinking or who you're watching. But with humans, we get this other thing that's intersubjective. And Sarah Hurdy argues that this is actually of great use for facilitating cooperative childcare, because it allows the mother who's like handing the baby around to be able to get a read on kind of who she trusts more and who she trusts less. So this is all pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, because also, I mean, I think that one of the patterns you can see show up in the way at least like popular versions of evolutionary biology goes.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is downstream of social Darwinism, partially, but is that people think there's either primarily competition or there's primarily cooperation. And when we actually take this down to the genetic level, what this kind of theory would show is that your offspring in certain situations do better if there's more than one person invested in their welfare,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And they're going to eat better, they're going to be taken care of, they're going to be watched over by more people,
Yeah.
which will allow them to thrive.
Yeah.
And so it's both involves cooperation and some selfishness, because those genes are going to do better, right?
Right.
With this like group process and group protection. And so it is an evolutionary advantage.
Right.
But it's just not one that's reduced to one principle, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like most good solutions are, it's a complication and a melding of the two aspects of the theory that might seem to be opposed. Human nature is neither totally peaceful and egalitarian or totally domineering. You know, it's like this melding of both that creates a certain kind of dynamic.
Or it's not it's not entirely altruistic.
Right.
Or entirely selfish.
Yeah, exactly.
But it also reminds me of like the first season of the podcast and talking about staying with the trouble, because I just think about how, you know, some interpretations of Haraway's work would say that all flourishing is actual mutual. It's always relational.
Yeah.
You know, and so these early humans learn to flourish in their environment through mutual care, but it also served them individually, and it served their genes and their offsprings.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's really cool to read about this, because one of the things that this allows us to see is that evolutionary biology and Darwinian evolutionary theory is not hostile to cooperation.
Right.
You know, it's not hostile to cooperation. And in fact, accounting for cooperation through a Darwinian lens is the cutting edge of Darwinian theory. Like, this is actually like so much attention is put towards this because it seems counterintuitive, maybe on the surface, but if you can show how what you're talking about, it's good for the genes or whatever, you know, then you can create a better account for cooperation than the other accounts that have come up so far, you know?
Oh, I will say that Kropotkin did lay out the groundwork for this with his book Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, because he was arguing that creatures that cooperate have a better chance of survival. He just hadn't applied that to human society.
Yeah, that's true. And one thing that I don't know about all this, and I haven't like researched, is like, what are the limitations and the advantages of Kropotkin's account of cooperation versus these newer accounts of cooperation? Like, how do they stack up against each other? I don't know the answer to that, actually. But it's true that Kropotkin came first.
Right.
I mean, by a long shot, by 100 years, you know? Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, next time you hear about Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene, don't get too distracted by the word selfish in there, because it's
or by Richard Dawkins.
Or by Richard Dawkins and his terrible presence in the world in so many ways. Because what's more neutrally called the gene-centered view of evolution is what these feminists and theorizers of cooperation are using to create these theories.
That's so wild.
You know? Yeah. Yeah. Super duper fascinating.
Oh, I was just also going to say that I think that I gave you that book a few years ago that was about dogs and the earliest domesticated animal being dogs, and it also had to do with that sclera. Partially.
Yes, I was just thinking about this, and I'm glad you said it, because I meant to, and then, yeah, but I always think about dogs, because dogs have the white sclera. Dogs have the white sclera. You can't always see
the whole thing.
Very much of it, you know, but definitely dogs will look this way and that, and you can see their white sclera.
And they watch human eyes.
And there is like a intersubjectivity that happens between humans and dogs. I mean, and obviously between dogs and dogs, but that is it's really fascinating to think about applying this to that, you know? Yeah. And the coevolution of humans and dogs, which, Janet gave me this great book called The First Domestication is what it's called. And it's about humans' relationship with wolves, you know, wolves/dogs. And the first domestication in that title is not really a one-way domestication. Kind of, that's a little teaser into the book. It kind of goes both ways. It's like we were both sort of domesticated into relationship with each other as part of the thesis of the book there. So, earlier we mentioned the grandmother hypothesis. It's an elaboration of the idea of cooperative childcare in general. So you can have cooperative childcare with just whoever is in your band, your group, your community. But the grandmother hypothesis, it's so funny. The grandmother hypothesis highlights the role of grandmothers in that community of care. And grandmothers, when you read about this, it's kind of, they say funny things like, we didn't always have grandmothers. Grandmothers didn't always exist. They had to like be invented. And part of what this gets at is, for one thing, the question of menopause. So this is all still humans, right? We're still talking about humans only now. But why did evolution select for women to live for a long time post reproductive years?
Because that's not the case for primates, any other primates.
Yeah.
Or most other animals.
Yeah.
That there is not life after reproductivity.
Yeah.
You know? And so, yeah, I actually had heard of the grandmother hypothesis for quite a while, but didn't realize how much it was tied to like theorizing around menopause.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting.
Yeah.
Because they're just like, nobody else does this. Why do we do this? And what happened? You know?
Yeah. And one of the explanations for it is so that grandma can stick around and help take care of her children's children. You know, so the grandmother that helps provide childcare and is a benevolent, helpful force in the lives of her children and grandchildren. This is maybe something that emerged for humanity in this context of evolving big brains, need for more help raising children, and cooperative childcare.
I think also there's a tie-in to diversifying food ways, and so relying more in like having like a substantial amount coming from tuber collection and processing, which is something that has been observed that like grandmothers and children and grandchildren do together. that kind of detail gets really interesting. It's like grandmothers are more specialized for tuber collection in a lot of situations, and will teach the kids how to do it. And so there's a not just child care, but also like teaching the skills of life, and in the meantime, like bringing in usable food and calories and nutrients and stuff at the same time, being the role of grandmothers. And then obviously from like the selfish gene type of theory, like a grandmother would be highly invested in the survival of her grandchildren, because her grandchildren are likely to be carrying several of her genes as well. So that's like the selfish gene kind of angle. And how, you know, it's not just, there's cooperative childcare maybe within a band, and that can be sort of a universal as well, but there will tend to be greater investment of these elders, and especially elder women. And there's a theory around that too, because it's easier to know for sure who your children are if you're the one who gave birth to them. You know, so based on that fact, you know, that like a male there's always going to be a little bit greater degree of certainty as to who your children are if you're a male, a greater degree of uncertainty, as to who your children are if you're a male. So that would predict that there would be some percentage less investment on the part of the male grandparents than the female, and that does turn out to be the case, you know. So these Darwinian things have some amount of predictive power over what we see out there. And then the last little bit that I want to go into here, and we're barely going to touch on this, it's more of just a pointer into something that you might find fascinating as if you were going to read into it more. But the reason why Camilla Power's article is called Gender Egalitarianism Made Us Human has to do partially with what we were talking about grandmothers and cooperative childcare, because the presence of grandmothers implies a condition where women did not need to be separated from their mothers to go find a mate. So that implies matrilocality, which is a far better setup to resist male dominance, right? So there's that. But then going further into a little bit more of the mate selection type of theory, Camilla Power points out that a attractive strategy for males
and you see this with some other primates, but an attractive reproductive strategy for males,
Human males.
for human males, for gorilla males, for
Okay.
chimpanzee males, would be to have as many offspring as possible
Mm-hmm.
with minimal investment
Right.
in actually taking care of those offspring.
Mm-hmm.
You can save your energy for your own survival and just to be the father of as many babies as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that males will act when they seek that kind of advantage is to fight over access to females,
Mm-hmm.
use violence to get access to females, and then to identify the females that are fertile,
Mm-hmm.
and then just, I think she says, monopolize the fertile moment,
Mm-hmm.
and then move on to the next female,
Mm-hmm.
right? This would be a very cutthroat reproductive strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like humans have never engaged in that strategy.
No.
Or our ancestors, or even humans that live
Mhm.
today, right? But she says that there's reason to believe that this was actually not the way of life for most of human prehistory, for
Mhm.
humans. And part of it is the evidence that we have already provided, but also part of it is the ethnographic evidence
Mhm.
for female coalitions that has actually been witnessed in some African contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, like the Bayaka from the Congo Basin have been mentioned by Camilla Power, for the women to actually create coalitions of their own, coalitions of women to basically control reproductive access for men. And the way that this could look,
Mhm.
and what's kind of being theorized here, is like a prototype, like a template for a form of gender egalitarian mate selection
Mhm.
that may very well go far back in African history,
Mhm.
is something that looks kind of like this. So the strategy for an opportunistic male
Mhm.
would be to like try to identify the fertile females and monopolize the fertile moment. And for some primates, the fertile moment is pretty obvious, like your butt turns red
Yeah.
or something like that to signify fertility and that you're receptive. And humans don't have that. It's actually pretty subtle.
Mhm.
So the next best signal, so the theory goes, would be menstruation, which, if you were menstruating, you can try to keep that secret, but maybe it's a little harder than some things to keep secret. And menstruation is important because even though you're not fertile at the time of menstruation,
Mhm.
you will be soon,
Mhm.
right? And if you're pregnant, you're not menstruating and you're not fertile. If you're breastfeeding, then for a long time of breastfeeding, you probably won't be menstruating. And then so if somebody is menstruating, then it means that like they're going to have a fertile cycle. And the theory goes, and this is like an extrapolation from doing ethnography, but also it's a projection kind of into the past of maybe this is how it went. The theory goes is that instead of trying to like hide menstruation
Mhm.
in order to have more of a say over who you mate with, if anybody, the strategy in the female coalition was to actually kind of make a big deal out of it.
Mhm.
Make a big deal out of it by identifying the menstruating woman, putting her in like a hut or something, like a seclusion place, and then announcing basically that this was a menstruating person, implying that fertility was on the way, and then demanding
Mhm.
kind of, I don't know about a competition, but like demanding on the part of men performance, material performance, like bringing in food and stuff like this for the coalition to show that you could provide and that you would, and that you would like comply with the demands of the female coalition. And this is kind of, it's like a form of gatekeeping
Mhm.
reproductive access for the males.
Mhm.
And it's a way of preventing the dominance of these more violent male-centered strategies of reproduction in which the females don't benefit and have no say.
Mhm. And also it's occurring to me that there would be, with the grandmother evolution,
Yeah.
the evolution of grandmothers, there are more women of various ages
Yeah.
It's intergenerational,
It's intergenerational.
coalitions of women
Mhm.
who are doing this
Mhm.
ritualized
Mhm.
announcement / protection of the fertile women.
Yeah. Yeah, you can really imagine it being an intergenerational coalition of women who carried this out. And there was a lot of ritual around it, not just the ritual of the menstruating woman going into seclusion, but there were dances associated with this potentially, because we still see this surviving now in tribes like the Bayaka, in tribes specifically in Africa. Like, this is apparently like an African custom, to my knowledge, is what I've gathered. But because Africa is the origin, then people are able to extrapolate this back. And so there's ritual, there's dances that have to do with, go and bring in the prey, go and bring in the meat, all so that the men have to like prove themselves, like they have to do something to earn the access, and not just they get it because they're opportunistic or they're violent or something. And then where this theory gets really kind of mind-bending and interesting too, is that because menstruation is at the center of this practice, both the actual ones and like the hypothesized ancient one, the color red has a central place, and adorning oneself with red for these rituals is a likely component. Most of us know that cultures around the world have rituals and taboos and culture and stuff around menstruation. It's really common. So it shouldn't be surprising to hear about something like this, even though they're arguing that this takes these specific forms for these specific reasons. And I guess in like the 1990s, there came a hypothesis that goes by the name of female cosmetic coalitions. And it describes the kind of coalitions that I've been talking about, but also brings the cosmetic aspect in to focus on the need for red pigments and the usage of red pigments to, highlight the menstruation that was happening at the time when these rituals and dances and things were going on. The female cosmetic coalitions hypothesis predicted at that time that eventually archaeology would find some of the earliest usage of pigments in human culture to be red ochres. And they had a theory for like the time period in which they would be seen to emerge. And it was basically, I don't have it right in front of me, but I think that it was like basically around the time of the emergence of modern humans. And this has been, since the 90s, has been confirmed by more evidence.
Oh, right, because there is red ochre. Some of the earliest cave art at this point is red ochre.
Yeah,
I can't remember.
I'm not sure about cave art, but the earliest evidence now of human artistic production or use of pigments is now being pushed back into the hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Oh, right.
And specifically, I think the oldest find was in southern Africa, where you find like a pigment workshop.
Oh, right.
Where ochres were molded into like crayons and stuff, like basically for body painting.
Whoa.
So the female cosmetic coalition's hypothesis is like, they're basically saying, and this is the mind-bending thing, and why she says gender egalitarianism made us human, is that culture, and so therefore the earliest evidence of culture like symbolic anything, so the color red being symbolic of menstrual blood, red ochre pigment being symbolic of menstrual blood, came out of these female coalitional practices to create a favorable condition for mate selection in human cultures and to achieve gender egalitarianism.
Wow.
And cooperative childcare and all of these things. And that it was this struggle, if you want to call it that made us human, that sent us down the path that humans went down to who we are now. And they predicted it to be right at the emergence of anatomically modern humans because humanity is defined by cooperative childcare, which was demanded by these female coalitions. Like, you don't get to become human without this. And that it was actually also the origin of art.
Whoa.
And culture in general. We have art because of this. we have dance because of this. We have ritual because of this ritual. Historically speaking, at least.
Right. Yeah, that's wild.
Isn't that wild? And it's just a theory.
Right.
But if you all are interested in this, if you followed this, I know it's kind of a lot, but yeah, there's a Wikipedia entry on female cosmetic coalitions. You can read more about this.
Mm-hmm. And then follow all the links to the different studies.
Yeah, and definitely read the Camilla Power article that I'm going to link to.
Well, it's interesting. So if we put this idea together, that a lot of different forms of art and culture had to do with creating more favorable conditions for women and their offspring, too. Yeah. Basically, because there's going to be an abundance of resources that are being shared and redistributed instead of whoever's the biggest gets all the access and makes all the babies.
Right.
Whether or not there's resources for those babies.
Right.
So we have that, and then on the other end, we have Boehm's kind of the work that's built from his theories, which is that stories and culture and ideas around embedded mythos and legends and culture that says we should be sharing, we should be the storytelling that happens and arises also came from cooperation. Yeah,
that's kind of implied by Boehm's work, at least. I think he touches on that. Yeah. I mean, his is less of a feminist take, actually. Sure. He's more concerned with egalitarianism between males and kind of coalitions of males that don't want to be dominated, standing up to the would-be alphas and stuff like that. But he has the coalitional thing too, but it's not the feminist take that the other theorists would have.
So we have multiple versions of stories that talk about how coalition forming and cooperation are actually foundational to culture. Yeah. And that whatever form those take, and I think, you mentioned this with Boehm's work, but that there was a wide range of forms on the spectrum of egalitarianism, I'm putting in quotes over here, is pretty wide, and it's just all relatively egalitarian to now.
Boehm actually also talked about settled hunter-gatherers, he talked about pastoralists, he talked about agricultural people, where he saw a strain of egalitarian ethos still existing in all those forms in sort of the same type of pattern that he described with the coalitions and stuff, just, but it's different in every case, but it's not limited to just these immediate return hunter-gatherers. Right. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm just trying to say is that we're seeing all these examples from people who work in the field and are theorizing about that or doing broad surveys of field work, and they are noticing that people recognize power in all of these forms. Yeah. They create structures to deal with it. Yeah. They create ritual and stories that keep power at bay. Yeah. And so these are people who think that these cultures were more egalitarian than we are, and yet they understand power and they're not stupid savages.
Yeah, right. Okay. Innocence and stupidity and unawareness of power dynamics and potential trouble is just obviously not part of what these people are talking about. So that is just a false accusation. Whatever you think about all of this, and like I said before, I don't know what I think about all of this ultimately. I'm just trying to present, the best version of all these different stories so that we can think about them and talk about them.
And this is going to be important as we move into the next chapter, because we're going to be talking about unfreezing the Ice Age.
Oh, yeah.
And some of this is going to come up again, I think. Maybe not the hard speculative theories based on these ethnographies, but just the general patterns and the...
Yeah, it's actually going to get more archaeological / anthropological
soon.
Next chapter. The first couple chapters were the first chapter was sort of broad ideas referencing anthropology somewhat. The second chapter was a lot about Candia-Ronk and, the indigenous critique. And then after that, we actually delve deeper into explicitly anthropological and archaeological and deep human history concerns.
And also, there will be times when some of what we talked about today are going to be very briefly referenced, sometimes in a few paragraphs, and now you'll have the foundation to understand what they're talking about when we talk about it later.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. If you have made it to the end of this episode, then you will hopefully notice when some of these ideas are touched on, or when what some of these people are saying might have a bearing on something that the authors are putting forth, and you'll just have more to work with. So hopefully. Yeah, and there is a brief unnamed mention of Sarah Hurdy in chapter 3.
That's true.
Yeah. But we'll talk about that next time.
Next time. All right.
All right.
Bye for now.
Come find us in the Discord. And let's talk about this more.